I'll see you in hell. The voice rang out over the television. Clint Eastwood in High Plains Drifter. It was one of her favorites. Donated generously by her father's love of spaghetti westerns, an acquired taste, but passed down gracefully. She'd fallen asleep on the couch watching it, and it had, subsequently, woken her up. Her little studio apartment was what some might have called unique. The couch sat low on the floor, as she had taken off the legs. Her bed did as well, and there were lights pointed at every object in her place, from every angle. There was not a single shadow to be cast anywhere. That was, after all, where a lot of them came from. Completely white and boring, but relatively safe and free of darklings. There would be some, off and on, but the most severe attacks she had had in recent years was at the grocery store 7 years ago with Dane. She was 25 now and lived alone. It was by choice. She could have had her share of the male population without coercion. She just preferred to be alone. She had been doing studies recently of the supernatural and spiritual, just to see if there was anything that could link her own situation to others. She'd found several things that could have passed as related, but nothing more solid than a particular series of incidents that happened in this very state in the late 60s. That was as far as she had come so far. After a good night's rest, she would continue. Her apartment was littered with open face-down books and papers strewn out like she worked for the Spokesman Review. She looked around at the chaos of it all and sighed, shaking her head. Later, she thought. She turned off the television, almost reluctantly, and headed off to bed just a few yards away. She kept all the lights on. She did every night. It was hell on her power bill, but it made her feel safe. Even if it was just a false sense of security, it was some sense of security at all. She pulled down her white blankets and sheet, and grabbed a book and settled in for the night. She knew she would fall asleep reading it like she always did, and again, that was a small sense of comfort to her. She had her attention focused on something else. Over the span of years, she had somewhat trained herself to focus her attention on other things than the ones that haunt her. Simple things, like books or cleaning, writing, or work. It was a small thing, but it kept her from losing her mind completely. And it wasn't too long before she was asleep. And with any luck, she wouldn't dream. She thumbed through the pages of her most recent venture into the paranormal at the local library. Clacking her pencil off the table while she read, she earned herself a shush from the single librarian working today. She looked up with a small smile and nodded. The stout little woman barely acknowledged her subtle apology before going on with what she was doing. She shrugged her shoulders and took her books over to the computer to do some deeper research. Her Yahoo search under paranormal activity, focused around Spokane, Washington, yielded many unexpected results. Her finds, however, were less than fortuitous, save for an article dated 1969 from the local newspaper. The headline read, "Redimona Pruitt, renowned parapsychologist found near dead. The article explained that she was found in her loft, apparently the victim of a vicious assault. The assailant was never apprehended, and the case was put into the cold files after a 3-year investigation. Redamona had apparently told police that she was attacked by a ghost or demon. Police, of course, did not believe her, as her eyes were gouged out with some household object like a spoon, and subsequently she was blamed for her own misfortune, saying she'd done it to herself. A gruesome tale. A bit more research told her that Redamona had been institutionalized several years after the attack. She had a psychotic break after the police deemed the search for her attacker cold and blamed her for the entire incident. She was held at Shady Acres Asylum for 7 years before finally being released and sent back to her home. She immediately moved to the Upper West Side of Spokane and became a recluse. It is said that she never leaves her home, and well into her 70s now, she refuses to talk to anyone about the accident. Her line of work before it was what Frankie was most interested in. Parapsychology was a practice with the paranormal, namely the dead. And Frankie needed to know if Redamona could help her to understand her visitors, maybe even get rid of them. "I'm sorry, Miss Welch, but Mrs. Pruitt doesn't see guests. She's a very solitary woman." The gentleman that answered the door was dressed in a crisp white shirt hidden under a sleeveless green sweater. His khaki pants were ironed with a crease and folded at the ankles above his black Armani shoes. His tie was tucked away beneath the sweater, and his haughty demeanor was less than pleasant. His brown hair was speckled with gray, and his eyebrows were recently tweezed, as evident by the red splotch between them. His hand stayed in his pocket as he leaned casually against the open door. The expression on his face was very matter-of-fact. She didn't even know him, and she already hated him. "Please, it's very important that I see her. I really must talk to her," Frankie insisted. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can—" He was abruptly cut off. "Let the poor girl in, Andrew. She's obviously here for a reason." The old woman, caning her way toward the couch, said firmly, her white hair nearly falling over the dark glasses she wore. She was a very maternal-looking figure, mid-70s, thicker than the average female, but pleasantly plump for a woman her age. Her silk blouse had a bellow of frills spilling over the silk gray vest she wore over it, its ties trailing behind her just above her ankles. She wore a long white skirt to accent the blouse, and what looked like nurse's shoes over a pair of thick wool stockings. "Are you sure, ma'am?" He turned to ask her. "Of course I am. Let the poor girl in. It's freezing outside," she replied as she sat down on the sofa just parallel to the door. She propped her cane against the arm of the couch and reached for the cup of tea that sat waiting for her on the coffee table. Andrew led her in and moved quickly to the chair across from Redamona. "Mrs. Pruitt, I need your help," Frankie began. Before she continued, the old woman began speaking to her. "I love this weather. It reminds me of my childhood here. Long autumn days spent outside raking leaves with my father, and then jumping in them when his back was turned. She giggled like a young girl then. I miss those days. Seems the old adage is true. Youth is truly wasted on the young. She smiled and took a sip of her tea. Her voice had an attitude to it that was bereft most women her age. Sort of alive and very aware of it. Frankie thought it was kind of nice. Redamona reached to the table and pulled out a cigarette from a silver case and lit it, inhaling the first drag deeply and slowly exhaling, letting the used smoke go up her nose. Frankie's brow furrowed for a moment, confused at what she was seeing. I have some questions I need to ask you, Frankie repeated. Oh, I know you do, dear. She took another heavy drag from her cigarette and exhaled before she spoke again. The question is, are yours the right ones, and are you ready for the answers? She said nonchalantly. It seemed as though she was staring right at her through the pitch glasses she wore. She could almost feel it. I just need to know what it is that's been happening to me since I was a child. What's wrong with me? You were a parapsychologist. Can't you give me some explanation? She asked the old woman in earnest. I can't if you don't tell me what it is, kiddo. If you do that, we'll see what I can do for you, she said, taking another drag and flicking the ashes from the cigarette directly into the ashtray beside her. She was taken aback by that. For some reason, she just assumed the old woman had already known why she was there. Why would she assume such a thing? This woman had not even left her home since the mid-70s. She had never even seen or heard of Frankie before. I am so sorry, ma'am. I got way too far ahead of myself. Let me explain. She took a deep breath, but was interrupted before she even began speaking. The old woman was laughing, giddy as a schoolgirl, just laughing. No, child, I was just kidding. You don't have to explain anything. I know why you're here. She laughed out loud as she said it. Frankie looked baffled and confused. Again, she just wasn't sure what to think. How could this woman have known why she was there? It's all right, dear. You have no reason to worry. You said you knew I was a parapsychologist, and that can only mean a handful of things, but all leading to the same end. You want to know why you're being contacted, why you see things that other people don't, why? She took another drag. But are those the questions you really want to be asking? She asked intently. I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Pruitt, Frankie replied, unsure of what to think. She flicked another ash away and placed the cigarette in a dip in the ashtray. Haven't you ever noticed that to truly be afraid, all you really have to do is close your eyes? She appeared to be staring right at her, speaking to her as though she were a long-lost child, comforting and soothing, but her words were infinitely frightening to her. People see the world around them through a veiled vision, dear. Eyes are like curtains, hiding the world outside. Yours are more like shears. You can't see it very well, but you do see it, don't you? She said. She seemed to understand exactly why she was there, and she never had to say a word to her about it. Frankie replied quietly, near whispering, as she said her next sentence. I want it to go away. Redamona chuckled lightly. Why don't you just forget about it? Move on with your life and enjoy it, Frankie. Trust me, it's better than the alternative. She picked her cigarette up and took a small sip of tea and sat back. Please, Frankie whispered. Please tell me how to make it stop. Redamona seemed to stare through the glasses as though her eyes burned a hole through her stomach. You're wasting your time here if you think I have an answer for you. Enjoy your life, Frankie. Just be happy you're alive, she said. I can't. They won't let me. They won't go away. Please help me, she begged. Redamona didn't even show an inkling of concern. She simply sipped her tea and held on to her cigarette, barely lit now. It had been so long since she had smoked it. Enjoy your life, child. Frankie was losing her patience. She had taken the time to find this woman, had gone out of her way to come and see her, to maybe get some answers, maybe get rid of this problem. You have no idea what it is I'm going through. No idea, she said as she stood up to leave. Redamona sat forward and leaned into Frankie with her next words. You think so, child? She removed her glasses slowly, revealing pink hollows where her eyes once were, scarred over and shrunken in. I am the one with no eyes, young Frankie. But you are the one that is blind, she told her. Those were the last words Redamona said to her before placing her glasses back on, leaning back again and waving her away like she was a servant. Her hair actually flew into her face as the door was slammed behind her. What the hell? She muttered angrily under her breath. But she couldn't help but wonder what that last bit meant. It made no sense, and she dismissed it as just that. Nonsensical lunacy babbled by a crazy old lady. Nothing, she said, made any sense. Simply telling her to live her life and enjoy it, and no matter how many times she tried to tell her that the Darklings would not allow her to enjoy anything, she would simply interrupt her again and babble off more nonsensical lunacy. And of course, then again, wasn't she herself constantly accused of the same? Her train of thought was suddenly interrupted by a strange whisper behind her, one all too familiar. It grew louder and louder, muddling more and more, blaring in her head until she covered her ears. No, no, not again, she shouted. The whisper was soon followed by another, and another, overlapping into a barrage of incoherent hissing. She began to see them, coming from every direction, materializing from shadows and earth, coming toward her with their jutting movements and wicked faces, their long, thin fingers reaching out as though to take her with them to hell. An eerie wind began to blow all around her, kicking up dust and debris that made it hard for her to breathe. The closer they came, the clearer she could see them. "No, leave me alone!" she screamed at them. And then they were there, their heads turning themselves upside down on their necks in jerking movements that seemed surreal. She screamed out loud at them, and then they reciprocated, opening their mouths wide in a twisted and warped shape, bellowing out a sound that could only be described as a shrieking wail of noise that could have deafened anyone. Andrew opened the door. The voice was calm. It wasn't hers. The only thing she remembered after that voice was being yanked backwards, and then blackness. "Wake up, dear." The voice was soothing as it spoke to her. "Wake up." It was just a series of blurs when she opened her eyes. Blink. Again. She forced herself to be lucid. As her vision gradually cleared, she could eventually identify her surroundings. She was back in Redamona's home. Wasn't she just kicked out? Her head was pounding, throbbing with every beat of her heart. She could feel her pulse bursting in her temples, and the pain was so immediate and so great that she thought she might faint again. Easy. Just easy now. The comforting voice came again. "It's all over. They're gone now." "What the hell are these things?" she cried out in anguish. "Please tell me. I need to know what is going on. Why am I the only one who sees these things?" She begged for an answer. Suddenly it dawned on her. She had said, "They're gone now." How did she know? She gave Redamona an uncertain and almost angry look. "I think you owe me some sort of explanation. Please," she said as she sat up. Redamona sighed and sat back in her chair across from her. She took a sip of the tea sitting beside her and swallowed hard. She then crossed her hands in her lap and eased the chair into a gentle rocking motion. "What am I to tell you, child? My explanations wouldn't satisfy what it is you want to know," she said gruffly. "I have to know," Frankie replied, staring down at the floor. "This is all too much." Redamona chuckled at that. She bit her lower lip gently and wiped a strand of white hair from her forehead. "Ask away, kiddo," she said almost sarcastically. Frankie peeled her eyes from the floor and looked at Redamona sincerely. "What are they?" "Well, you'll have to be more specific than that, honey," Redamona replied. Frankie wanted to throw something at her. It was a simple enough question. "What are those things that just attacked me?" she hissed. Attacked?" Redamona replied, sounding almost shocked. "Oh, no, honey, you weren't attacked, no. They were just saying hello. You haven't been attacked, or you'd know it," she laughed. "They are what most refer to as shadows. A parallel to ourselves, the dark inside of us all, you might say," she said matter-of-factly. "Most can't see them as anything more than just simple shadows, but every once in a while She trailed off and took another sip of tea. Shadows, Frankie parroted her. She yanked up her sleeve abruptly, showed the fresh wounds, followed by the scars that covered her arm. Shadows don't do this, Redamona. Apparently, dear, yours do. She pursed her lips when she said it, almost agitated that she was being questioned at all. Frankie sighed heavily. Okay, shadows, but why? Why are they doing these things to me? Why can't other people see them? She asked. Oh, there are others that can see them, but like yourself, they just assume themselves crazy. And sadly, so does everyone else. So they get locked away from the rest of the world and stuffed full of drugs to numb the senses, blinding them from the world beneath the curtains. Some are blinded comfortably. Others become numb to everything, she told her, seeming to let her mind wander into another time. Her lips pursed again. She seemed almost angry now. Are you all right, dear? Andrew's voice came gently from the corner of the room. He wasn't speaking to Frankie, but to his dear Redamona. I'm fine, Andrew. Another cup of tea, please, love, she asked. And for you, Miss Frankie, Andrew asked. She was almost surprised that he was being courteous to her now. Don't seem so shocked, dear. Once he warms up, he's a very nice man, Redamona said in a low chuckle. Frankie looked back at Andrew. Yes, I would love some tea. Thank you, Andrew. He bowed slightly and turned toward the kitchen, walked away. Now, where were we? Redamona asked. Shadows, Frankie replied with a near whisper. Ah, yes, shadows, then. There are shadows. And then there are those others. I'm sure you've seen many things that you cannot explain, yes? Yes, too many things. The ghosts are the things with the grotesque wounds and pale skin, the things that show up out of nowhere and follow you around like a lost pup, or nothing to be scared of, but there are some that are violent, angry ghosts that died wrong, died terrible deaths that they can't escape. Most live in the same moments over and over again. Others just want revenge for what's been done to them. And it doesn't matter where they get it. Forget orbs and beams of light. Dust and sunshine aren't ghosts. If they want to be seen, they will be. She lit up a cigarette and took another sip of tea, just as Andrew had rounded the corner, holding a silver tray. He placed 2 cups on the table between them, with a dish of sugar and a small container of cream, with a large kettle of tea adorning the middle. He also laid out a fresh pack of Camel 99s on the table for Redamona. Thank you, dear, she said. Andrew nodded and left. He nodded, as though she could see him. Frankie thought it was a rude thing to do, but who was she to judge? I love it when he nods, Redamona laughed. Frankie's eyes grew wide. Redamona laughed harder. clapping her hands together in one swift motion and leaning her head back against the chair she sat in. "Now," Redamona said, as she strangled back her laughter, "you, my dear, will give it a gift. Whether you want it or not, it's yours. And there are very few things you could do to get rid of it. The shadows, well, they can be mean sons of bitches when they get angry. And trying to make them leave, well, that makes them angry, and understandably so. They have, after all, been here a hell of a lot longer than we have. We're just pets," she said, taking another drag from her cigarette and snuffing it out in the ashtray. "Pets?" Frankie said, her tone questioning. "Yes, pets, puppets, little playthings to amuse them." Redamona smiled as she explained. "It's something we all live with. The world passes us by, and we would go completely unnoticed were it not for the shadows. A fly on the horse's back, if you will. The whole lot of us. But there are the few of us that live with seeing them." She laughed then. "I suppose," she finished. "I'm not sure I understand," Frankie said, thinking out loud. "You probably never will, and you should thank your little lucky stars for it, Frankie. When I finally understood, it was far too late," she said, frowning now. "Just leave it be, girl. You're better off just to leave it be." She was so sincere. Her face, while void of expression, seemed to mourn, almost as if she were begging for her to just let it go. Eyes that were not even there seemed to look right through her, as though they were hiding somewhere behind the pitch glasses she wore, trying so desperately to tell her something that her words would not allow. But what? And why? "I feel like there's something you're not telling me, Redamona," Frankie insisted. Redamona just leaned her head back against the chair and sighed. She said nothing, just lit another cigarette and rocked gently back and forth. Frankie was at an impasse. She had not gotten all the information she came for, but she knew that Redamona Pruitt was done. She would give her nothing else. Just enjoy life and let it go. She knew she could do neither. Redamona had said that there were others like her, that they were locked away. It seemed like such a horrible place. Walls painted with a lime green fading into urine yellow in some places, plaster visible and crumbling to the floor in handfuls. Dark warnings scrawled into them like foreboding poetry, told in some nightmarish haiku. Even the lobby was a hellish place, filled with mind-deserted shells of what once were functioning human beings, bumbling about in what seemed to be a mass drug-induced confusion. One man sat in a corner in the fetal position wearing a bright yellow helmet, slamming his head into a wall over and over. He just kept repeating, "My name is Clyde." Frankie shivered at the cruelty of this place already. When she finally began to make her way to the front desk, the receptionist was sitting there, filing her fingernails and chewing a piece of bright red gum. Mid-30s, bright orange hair, neon makeup that did anything but complement her already harsh features. The tag on the front of her blue uniform read, "My name is Abby." Frankie hadn't even spoken to her yet, and she was already frustrated with Abby. But she held her tongue. Who was she to criticize how this establishment was run? She didn't work here. She was only a few paces from the receptionist's desk when she nearly lost her footing, slipping in a puddle of urine. She choked back a mixture of disgust and anger and proceeded. "Excuse me, I need to see a patient here." She trailed off, noticing that Abby was caught up in the television behind her desk, rather than paying attention to what she was saying. "Excuse me," she repeated. Abby did not respond. She was growing angry. Slamming her hands down on the desk, she shouted, "Excuse me!" Abby just rolled her eyes, slowly turned her chair to face Frankie, and huffed more audibly than necessary. "What?" Abby asked in a tone less than civil. "I need to see a patient you have here," Frankie replied, trying to be as polite as possible, though she felt like ripping the woman's head off. Abby kept chewing her gum and filing her nails, her mouth making that smacking sound every time she masticated. "Patient's name?" Abby asked, never removing her eyes from her fingernails. "Danika Bathory." Suddenly, the smacking sound stopped, and the nail file came to a halt so quickly that Frankie could have sworn it screeched. After a long pause, Abby closed her mouth for a moment before replying. "Why you want to see her?" Abby asked skeptically. "I need to ask her some questions," Frankie replied, growing increasingly more agitated. "No one's visited her since she's been in here," Abby said, her tone edging on confusion. "Plus, she's one of our more violent patients. You sure you're looking for her?" "Yes. I need to speak with her now, please," Frankie said, her tone reflecting her lack of patience. Abby sighed heavily and stood up, taking a short few steps to the dented metal door behind her chair. She pulled out keys hanging from a superfluous ring she carried with her and jammed one into the keyhole. She looked back at Frankie with exasperation and bobbed her head in so haughty a manner that Frankie began to feel that familiar need to take her head off again. This surprised her. She was not a violent person at all. "You coming, or do you need me to hold your hand? I got things to do, you know," Abby snapped. Frankie fought back her urge to stab her in the eye with the closest cumbrous object, and followed. The hall was long and narrow, trailing on for what seemed like miles, with a pitch blackness at the end that didn't seem to brighten as they went further. Tortured howls and screams emanated from further down, louder as they moved on. Frankie closed her eyes to the blackness ahead. Too familiar with what it was now to be comfortable seeing it. "Is there light down there?" Frankie asked. Abby just laughed at her, mocking her before replying. "Sounds like you should be in here with her," she chuckled. Frankie sighed and continued on. Fortunately, there was light. They were just too far from it to have seen it straight away. But at the end of the narrow hallway was a mass of locked doors and random noises from moaning floors and old rusted pipes. She could hardly believe the condition of this building. Couldn't believe that people were allowed inside it even. It was unlivable. The people were forced to live in it. Psychotic or no, no one should have to live in such miserable conditions. Abby halted abruptly at a door marked 3122564. An orange sign, badly frayed at the edges, read, "All visitors, caretakers, and staff must wear protective gear at all times when entering this room." Abby's keys jingled in her hand as she opened the lock. Abby was not wearing protective gear, and neither was Frankie. This hospital was a joke. Would she be hurt? Her concern was short-lived, but concern nonetheless. The door opened with a thud as Abby yanked on the handle, and a blinding light blasted Frankie's eyes when she looked inside. "Have fun," Abby mocked as she smirked and began to walk away. "I'll assume you can find your own way out." Frankie just glared at her as she walked away, and then focused her attention on the door in front of her. The light was so bright that she had a difficult time seeing anything. Once adjusted to the blinding light, she opened the door further and inched her way inside, where she saw a pale-haired woman, though she had difficulty accepting her age. How could this woman be 66 years old? She was so beautiful. She sat on a mattress in the middle of the floor amid stark white walls. Nothing else was in the room. It was so well lit that not a single shadow was cast. Looked vaguely familiar to her. She sat there with her knees tucked into her chest and her arms wrapped around them. Her hair was more than disheveled. It was unrecognizable as hair. Locks of it falling over her face, masking her veteran features. She rocked back and forth nervously as she slowly raised her head to peer through the white-gray locks at Frankie. She thought about turning to leave, more like running like hell. But she stood her ground and swallowed her nervous sense of fear. "Miss Bathory?" Frankie said with an anxious tone. "My name is Frankie. I was wondering if you could answer a few questions for me?" Danika's eyes were almost violet as she stared at Frankie through the tangles of hair that had fallen into her pale white face. It looked almost as though she wore a fine white powder. "How did you find me? Everyone should keep away. Death waits here," she said, her expression half lunatic. Frankie thought for a moment that she had made a mistake coming here. "I read an article in an old newspaper about you. It said you used to own the Hartwhite Museum in California, that you had..." Frankie paused for a moment. That you had a psychotic breakdown and saw things that weren't there?" Frankie finished nervously. "I need to know what it is you saw." Danika stared at her with that same look painted on her face. Frankie was frightened for a moment that Danika might kill her. After all, it was a touchy subject for her. She could only imagine what it must be like for Danika Bathory. "No shadows. Shadows bring him, shadows bring death. The devil. Death waits here. He waits for me. He waits for me. to turn off the lights so he can have me again. He needs to eat. No shadows. She finally said, her eyes twitching and jutting all around the room she sat in, as though she were crazed, searching for the slightest hint of what it was she spoke about. What she said made very little sense. "You know about the shadows?" Frankie asked in a soft voice. Suddenly the movement stopped. Too suddenly. It was so abrupt that it made her even more uncomfortable than she already was. She almost wanted to back away. "The shadows," she said in a harsh whisper. "No shadows here. They come from the heart." She stood up quickly and ran around the room in a near frenzy. "You see, no shadows, just light. They won't come from the light. It's okay here. It's okay here. It's okay here," she repeated, almost singing. "You should stay, child. It's safe here." Frankie backed away as she passed her. But Danika was so quick to move back to her that she hadn't the reflexes to move away. Her face was only centimeters away from hers when she spoke. "Stay in the light," Danika whispered to her with wide eyes. "Stay in the light." With those haunting words in mind, Frankie backed out of the room as Danika slowly made her way back to her mattress and into the exact same position she started in. Frankie closed the heavy door and listened to the lock slide into place, feeling a sense of remorse and urgency for the insane woman, now that she could not explain. Somehow she knew. But she was so tortured and tormented by her own mind that when she tried to warn Frankie of something impending, only gibberish came out. As she made her way back down the desolate hallway, through the screams and creaks and moans, she knew she would eventually have to come back to Danika Bathory and somehow make sense of what was happening.